The Honourable Member Calgary-Nose Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased today to rise and implore colleagues to support this common sense and fair-minded motion that is before us today. The motion reads, for those watching at home, given that the government has announced a temporary 3-year pause to the federal carbon tax on home heating oil, the House call on the government to extend that pause to all forms of home heating. The motion is about the carbon tax, but ultimately it's about being fair to all Canadians, regardless of region and regardless of home heating source. That's what this motion is asking for, Madam Speaker, fairness. But it also acknowledges something else. And that something else is in direct response to the assertion made this morning by the member from Thunder Bay, Rainy River, which is that the carbon tax is working and that it's worth the immense cost to the constituents in his expansive riding, many of whom pay a lot of things to do things like heat their home and get around. And so, Speaker, I want to lay out for the House the fact that the carbon tax is not working and that it's not worth the cost. In the heart of this motion is the fact that after 8 years of Liberal government, not only is the carbon tax not working, it's exacerbating the inflationary crisis and financial hardship for Canadians. This is another reason why Conservatives have put this motion forward today. Ahead of our Wednesday morning caucus meeting, and as winter temperatures began to set in across the country, the Leader of the Opposition announced that Conservatives would, in fact, force a vote in the House of Commons on Monday to extend a 3-year carbon tax exemption that was announced by the Prime Minister last week for Atlantic Canadian home heating oil to all forms of home heating in every part of Canada. I know that the temptation for Liberal and perhaps NDP colleagues will be to continue to toe the line that the Prime Minister took this week, which was that no additional carve-outs on the carbon tax would be forthcoming, and perhaps vote against this motion. Perhaps the Bloc will as well, too. But that position is a mistake, both morally and politically. If anybody in this chamber cares about public support for climate action, the inflation crisis, and frankly keeping their jobs, they should vote in favor of this motion, and here's why. While inflation and the cost of living remain the top electoral concerns for Canadians, a very recent survey by Leger suggested that about 70% of Canadians are worried about climate change. However, support for keeping the Liberals' signature climate policy, the carbon tax, only registers with the support of 18% of Canadians. The reason for the vast delta, that gap between public concern for addressing climate change and support for the climate tax, is something that few NDP, Liberal, or Bloc intelligentsia appear to have considered. And that blind spot is now both politically biting them in the rear and is preventing Canada from meeting its emissions targets. So what is that reason? What is the reason behind that gap? The carbon tax is failing to move consumer preferences away from high carbon products and practices in the way that the Liberals promised that it would, and Canadians know it. In the middle of a generationally high cost of living crisis, all Canadians, even those very concerned about climate change, are unwilling to pay for a policy they know to be ineffectual. Said differently, people will only choose alternatives to things like driving carbon-powered vehicles and heating their homes with carbon-based fuels if other options exist, if those options are readily available, and if they are affordable. Those circumstances may be partially available in other more temperate and highly populated regions of the world, but that's not so much the case across the rest of our country. So even though the Liberals and the NDP and frankly the Bloc seem to be content with keeping the tax in this scenario, Canadians aren't choosing to purchase alternatives because in most parts of Canada, they don't widely exist and they're completely unaffordable. You know, Madam Speaker, if you're ever in the beautiful riding of Calgary-Nose Hill, I encourage you to come and drive up a piece of road. It's Center Street, it turns into Harvest Hills Boulevard, and there's a beautiful laneway along a big chunk of that for a light rapid transit. And for 10 years, I have been trying to implore different levels of government to build out light rapid transit in that corridor. That would pull 50,000 cars off the road every day. And yet we do not see leadership from this government on building out this type of critical infrastructure that would actually deliver social inclusion for my community and could actually materially reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And instead, no, Madam Speaker, we see this dogmatic adherence to a policy that does not work. This concept is simple to grasp for even the most politically disconnected Canadians, particularly when they fill up their car and pay a carbon tax, but have no public transit alternatives and pay a carbon-based home heating bill for 6 months of brutal cold with no other option. LRT debacles in Ottawa. I encourage everybody to try take the LRT to your place tonight here in Ottawa. Good luck. Good luck, my friends. Edmonton, Calgary, and the Greater Toronto Area are perfect examples of this situation. Another good example is that after nearly a decade of wasted time, greenhouse gas emissions, and hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the administration of the carbon tax, the Liberals haven't managed to deliver alternatives to things like heating oil. The measures the Prime Minister announced this week, a decade late and thousands of dollars short, won't even pay for a Big Mac value meal for rural Canadians each month. Earlier today, the NDP member from Timmins said as much in the debate when he stated, "In Canada, heating homes isn't a luxury." He's right. It's not a luxury. It's a necessity. If you can't heat your home, you freeze. And the Liberal member from Kings Hants also said something similar when he stated that if Canadians don't have the money to make a change to a different form of heating, then they're stuck. And stuck is a great way to describe the situation many Canadians find themselves in right now. But the question Canadians now want answered is how the Liberals and their coalition partners in the NDP plan to get them financially unstuck after a decade of failure. A decade of Liberal rule has also shown people that this federal government isn't, putting it mildly, particularly good at building out the infrastructure like public transit, beefed up electrical grids, or a national system of EV charging stations needed to do things like pull gas-powered cars off the rolls. No, they expect people to pay a carbon tax with no alternative. They expect people to pay a carbon tax on home heating with no alternative. That is the record of 8 years of Liberal government. The carbon tax isn't working, and yet they expect people to pay for it in the middle of winter on their heating bill. But the Liberal government does seem to be good at one thing, blowing a lot of tax dollars and political attention on waste and scandal, like the SNC-Lavalin scandal, the We Charity scandal, the ArriveCAN scandal, the foreign interference crisis. None of those things will bring inflation under control or address climate change. This government's record on both fronts is abysmal, and they don't want to be held to account on that front. The government is not meeting its climate targets, Madam Speaker. They're just taxing Canadians with a policy that doesn't work. Further to this point, this week's serious whistleblower allegations regarding allegations of gross misappropriation at Sustainable Development Technology Canada, an agency that's supposed to spur the development and deployment of emissions reductions technology, will undoubtedly further erode public trust in the Liberal government's capacity to provide lower-cost alternatives to carbon fuels. I want to read out of this article because I don't think people at home have heard much about this scandal. It just broke this week. I want to read, so I guess somebody named Doug McConaughey, he's a Assistant Deputy Minister at Innovation, he's been working with whistleblowers on this file, and they recorded him. And this is what came out of the recordings when they were looking at the misappropriation of funds in this giant slush fund that's supposed to deliver low-cost alternatives and combat climate change. I will read from, this is a CBC article, Madam Speaker. By late July, McConaughey was convinced certain spending decisions were badly handled, including payments of nearly $40 million during the pandemic that was not based on precise needs and did not require follow-ups. It was free money, he said. It was free money. I know there's a lot of people in my community that would like free money. This was free money designed to combat climate change that went to some sort of liberal cronies. We don't even know how. And the people who made these decisions still have a job. The government's known about this for months, years, and they still have a job, and they expect us to believe that they care about getting inflation under control or that they care about climate change. It was free money, he said, before making an analogy with the controversy that affected is putting it nicely, it brought down former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien's Liberal government in the early 2000s. That is almost a sponsorship scandal level kind of giveaway. This is a fund that was supposed to be addressing climate change in Canada, and it turned into what, as everything else is done with this government, a slush fund for Liberal cronies. So people who care about climate action, people who care about getting inflation under control, don't look at the Liberal government, because they don't care. They just virtue signal on these things, and they give away tax dollars to their friends while people are expected to pay tax on home heating in the middle of a Canadian winter. And that's disgusting. That has an impact on climate change. Again, like, how do these people have jobs? Oh. All of these facts, Madam Speaker, you don't have to take my word for them, because the results are laid bare in recent government reports that show that even with the carbon tax, Canada will still miss its 2030 emissions targets by close to 50%. I've heard so many Liberals get up today and talk about the forest fires and impacts on climate change. Yet they're dogmatically supporting a policy that doesn't work, that, according to the governor of the Bank of Canada and Finance Committee, says is affecting inflation in a major way, right? Tiff Macklem said this at committee yesterday. They're dogmatically being adhere to a policy that doesn't work when they know that Canada's on track to miss its emissions targets by 50%. Canadians know this. They know that the carbon tax isn't working. They know it. There's proof of these facts in recent political trends, too. The Liberals' capitulation on the tax on home heating oil should have been viewed as an inevitability for even the most lay observer. The signs have been present for months. For example, in August, a Nova Scotia provincial riding that has been a safe Liberal hold for time immemorial was flipped by provincial Conservatives due in part to the unpopularity of the federal Liberal carbon tax. Within the federal Liberal backbench, there has also been extreme dissent over this issue, likely due to the sustained precipitous drop in polls that the party has seen. These incidents have followed nearly a year of high-profile campaigning by the leader of the Conservative Party against the tax. And I've heard colleagues in the Liberal complain that we've brought motion after motion in this House to fight the tax. You're absolutely right. We're going to keep doing it because it doesn't work and it's costing Canadians. Now that same crisis has overlaid the tax, and it means millions of Canadians are now facing the prospect of choosing between heating and eating. Never mind considering, as some of my colleagues are talking about, buying expensive alternatives that might not even exist in their regions. That is the most bourgeois concept I have ever heard. Much like the member of Edmonton Centre said, well, everybody can buy a heating pump. You buy a heating pump, and you buy a heating pump. Does he not know that people in his own community can't even afford their rent? The Prime Minister's late-stage partial capitulation on moving the tax for heating oil but not for other carbon heating fuels also risks creating perverse incentives like the one mentioned by the rural municipalities of Alberta, who suggested that the Liberals' partial tax exemption may actually generate higher demand for higher-emitting heating oil in certain circumstances. Keeping the tax with regional inequities will also further divide our country at a time when we need to unify. The world has changed, and our country needs to be strong, not pitted against each other by inequitable policies that do nothing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our country. So contrary to the opinions of many left-leaning pundits, after 8 years of climate failure and after the creation of an inflationary crisis, no one here should continue to lean into this tax. It needs to go.
Je regrette interrompre le député de Calgary-Nose Hill, mais
I'm sorry to interrupt the member.
it being 5:43, it is my duty to interrupt the proceedings and to put forth with every question necessary to dispose of the business of supply. The question is as follows. Mr. Polyev, seconded by Mr. Shipley, moved that given that the government has announced a, and I quote, temporary 3-year pause, unquote, to the federal carbon tax on home heating oil, the House call on the government to extend that pause to all forms of heating. If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. I recognize the honourable member from Barrie-Innisfil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request a recorded division.
Pursuant to Standing Order 45, the division stands deferred until Monday, November 6, 2023, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions.